Sometimes the people we cast aside are the ones who needed us most. In the winter of 1878, the town of Sweetwater Ridge decided that Clara Bennett, a quiet seamstress, wasn't good enough for their respectable community. They sent her up the mountain to Silas Cord's cabin, a feared former trapper who'd chosen isolation over civilization. The townsfolk expected her to come running back within days, broken and begging. But something unexpected happened in that lonely cabin. Clara's gentle strength touched something in Silas he thought was long dead. Together, they began building something the judgmental town below could never understand. What happens when two outcasts find exactly what they need in each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning frost clung to the windows of Clara Bennett's small room above the general store like accusations made of ice. She sat at the edge of her narrow bed, fingers working automatically through the familiar motions of fastening her mother's cameo brooch to the collar of her plain grey dress. The delicate piece, carved from shell with a woman's profile rendered in ivory against a background of coral pink, was the last beautiful thing she owned. Her mother had worn it on her wedding day, and Clara had done the same barely 18 months ago, back when the future seemed to hold promise instead of judgment. That future had died with Thomas, her husband of only 7 months. But it wasn't his death that condemned her in the eyes of Sweetwater Ridge. It was what came after. The debts. The whispered accusations. The way proper ladies suddenly found reasons to cross the street when they saw her coming. Clara had spent the weeks since Thomas's burial trying to hold her head high, trying to keep her sewing business alive, trying to convince herself that truth would eventually prevail over gossip. She'd been wrong. Last night, the town council had delivered their verdict. She was to leave Sweetwater Ridge. But they wouldn't simply send her away to another settlement where she might start fresh. No, they had something else in mind. Something they believed would teach her proper humility. They were sending her to Silas Cord. Clara had heard the stories, same as everyone. Silas Cord was the ghost of the mountain, the wild man who'd turned his back on civilization 8 years ago and never looked back. Some said he'd gone mad with grief. Others whispered darker things, about violence and danger, and a man who'd forgotten how to be human. The children of Sweetwater Ridge used his name to frighten each other in games. The adults spoke of him in hushed tones, when they spoke of him at all. And now Clara was to be sent to his cabin, alone, with winter settling heavy over the frontier. She understood the council's reasoning, cold as the December wind. If she survived the experience and came back down the mountain, she'd be sufficiently humbled. If she refused to go, she'd be declared vagrant and driven from the territory entirely. And if Silas Cord sent her away, or worse, well, that would solve their problem just as neatly. A woman like her, tainted by scandal and debt, wasn't worth the trouble of Christian charity. Clara stood and moved to the small mirror above her washstand. The face that looked back at her was 24 years old, but had learned too much about the world's cruelty in recent months. She'd been called pretty once, with her dark hair and clear grey eyes, her mother's fine bone structure. Thomas had said she was beautiful, but Thomas had said many things that turned out to be lies. No, that wasn't fair. Thomas had loved her. She believed that much. He'd simply been weak, easily led by stronger men with cruel intentions. He'd gambled away money they didn't have, borrowed from men who made their living on others' desperation, and left her to face the consequences when his heart gave out from the stress of it all. The town blamed her. Somehow, in the peculiar mathematics of frontier justice, Thomas's failings had become her shame. A knock at the door pulled Clara from her thoughts. "Mrs. Bennett?" The voice belonged to Deputy Mitchell, a young man who at least had the decency to sound apologetic. "The wagon's ready, ma'am. Mr. Garrett says we need to leave within the hour if we're to make the trip before dark." "I'll be down directly," Clara replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. She had one trunk, purchased second-hand after the creditors had taken everything else. Inside were her few remaining possessions: 3 dresses, undergarments, a spare pair of boots, her sewing kit with its precious needles and thread, a wool blanket, and the small wooden box that held her mother's letters. The cameo brooch would stay pinned to her collar. She wouldn't give the town the satisfaction of seeing her without it, this last token of dignity. Clara descended the narrow stairs to find a small crowd gathered in the street. Not to see her off with well wishes, she knew. They'd come to witness the spectacle, to confirm their judgment with their own eyes. She recognized most of them. Mrs. Patterson, who'd once commissioned a dress for her daughter's wedding. Mr. Walsh, from the bank, who'd refused to give Clara more time to settle Thomas's accounts. And there, standing slightly apart, with a look of satisfied righteousness, was Council Leader Harrison and his son, James. James Harrison had proposed marriage to Clara 3 months after Thomas's death. She'd refused him as gently as she could manage, explaining that her grief was too fresh, her situation too uncertain. But James Harrison wasn't a man accustomed to refusal. His father had power in Sweetwater Ridge, and together they'd ensured that Clara's rejection carried a price. Now she understood. This wasn't about justice or morality. This was about punishment for wounded pride. Deputy Mitchell helped her trunk onto the wagon bed with unnecessary care, as though gentleness now could somehow balance the brutality of what was happening. Clara climbed onto the bench seat beside Martin Garrett, a weathered trapper who'd agreed to guide her up the mountain for reasons she suspected had more to do with curiosity than kindness. "Ready, miss?" Garrett asked, not unkindly. Clara nodded. She didn't trust her voice. As the wagon pulled away from the general store, Clara allowed herself one glance back at Sweetwater Ridge. The town spread out along the valley floor looked almost peaceful in the winter morning light. Smoke rose from chimneys. Children played in the street. Life would continue here without her, and in a few weeks most people would forget she'd ever existed. The thought should have hurt more than it did. The trail up the mountain was rough, barely more than a path worn by decades of trappers and hunters who ventured into the high country. Garrett kept the horses to a careful pace, navigating around patches of ice and fallen timber. He didn't speak much, for which Clara was grateful. She wasn't ready for conversation, for the false sympathy or the inevitable warnings about Silas Cord. As they climbed higher, the character of the land changed. The sparse cottonwoods of the valley gave way to dense pine forests that seemed to swallow sound. Snow lay thicker here, pristine and undisturbed except for the tracks of animals. Clara spotted deer prints, the distinctive pattern of a mountain cat, the dragging trail of something she couldn't identify. This was wild country, beautiful and utterly indifferent to human concerns. "You ever been up this way before?" Garrett asked after an hour of silence. "No," Clara replied. "I've never had reason to leave town much." Garrett nodded as though this confirmed something he'd suspected. "It's different up here. Quieter. Some folks can't stand it. The silence gets inside their heads and they start hearing things that aren't there. Other folks find it suits them just fine." "Which kind is Mr. Cord?" "Can't rightly say, miss. I've seen him maybe 3 times in 8 years. He comes down to trade furs once or twice a season, gets his supplies, and disappears back up the mountain. Don't talk much. Don't cause trouble. Just wants to be left alone." "Then why would he agree to this?" Clara asked. "Surely the council asked his permission before sending me up here." Garrett's expression turned uncomfortable. "Well now, that's the thing. Far as I know, they didn't ask him at all. Council sent word yesterday saying you'd be coming, but I don't know if anyone waited for a reply. Silas, he doesn't exactly maintain regular correspondence with the town." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the December wind. "So I'm being sent to a man who doesn't know I'm coming and didn't agree to have me there. Council figures he won't turn away a woman in winter." Garrett said. "Whatever else Silas Cord might be, he's not cruel. He'll let you stay until spring, most like. What happens after that? Well, I suppose that's between you and him and the good Lord." The afternoon light was fading to purple dusk when the cabin finally came into view. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, a solid structure built from logs and chinked with careful precision. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, and a lean-to stable housed a single horse and what looked like a mule. Everything about the place spoke of careful self-sufficiency and deliberate isolation. Garrett pulled the wagon to a stop at the edge of the clearing. "This is as far as I go, miss. I'll help you with your trunk, but then I need to head back down before full dark." Clara nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd been prepared for this moment since the council's pronouncement last night, but preparation and reality were different things. Somewhere in that cabin was Silas Cord, and in a few moments her entire future would rest on his willingness to tolerate her presence. The cabin door opened before they'd finished unloading the trunk. A man stepped out onto the porch, silhouetted against the light from within. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with long dark hair and a beard that hadn't seen scissors in years. He wore simple clothes, wool trousers, a heavy shirt, boots made for hard use. In his hands he carried a rifle, held low but ready. "Garrett," he said. His voice was deep, rough from disuse. "What's this about?" "Message from the council, Silas," Garrett replied, suddenly nervous. "They sent this lady up to stay with you through the winter. Name's Mrs. Bennett." Silas Cord's gaze shifted to Clara, and she felt the weight of it like a physical thing. His eyes were dark, unreadable in the failing light. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, taking in her worn dress, her small trunk, the stubborn lift of her chin despite her fear. "No," he said finally, flatly. "Take her back down." "Can't do that, Silas," Garrett said. "Council's orders. She's been sent up here, and here's where she stays. I didn't agree to this. I know that. But it's done now. She's got nowhere else to go." Silas's jaw tightened. His knuckles went white on the rifle stock. For a moment, Clara thought he might actually order them both off his land at gunpoint, but then his gaze found hers again, and something in his expression shifted, not softening, exactly, but perhaps recognition of a sort. The look of one trapped creature seeing another. "One night," he said. "She can stay one night while the weather holds. Tomorrow, she goes back down with you." "I'm not coming back up tomorrow," Garrett said. "Next supply run won't be for 6 weeks at earliest." Then she waits 6 weeks and goes down with the next trader. "Silas, be reasonable. It's December. You can't send a woman back down alone, and there might not be another soul up this way until spring thaw." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken realities. Clara felt she should speak, should defend herself or plead her case, but her voice seemed to have abandoned her. She simply stood there in the snow, watching this stranger decide her fate. Finally, Silas turned without another word and disappeared back into the cabin, leaving the door open behind him. Garrett let out a breath. "Well, miss, I reckon that's as close to welcome as you're likely to get. I'd best be on my way before I lose the light entirely." He tipped his hat to her, climbed back onto the wagon, and started the horses moving. Within moments, the sound of the wagon faded into the vast silence of the mountain, and Clara stood alone in the clearing with her trunk and her mother's cameo brooch, and absolutely no idea what came next. Clara picked up her trunk by one leather handle and dragged it toward the cabin. The weight of it cut into her palm, but she welcomed the pain. It gave her something to focus on, besides the fear rising in her throat. The door stood open, warm light spilling out onto the snow, but it felt less like invitation and more like a dare. She stepped inside. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from outside, a single room, perhaps 20 feet square, with a sleeping loft tucked under the peaked roof. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flames crackling behind an iron grate. The furniture was simple but well made. A table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair near the fire, shelves lined with supplies and tools. Everything spoke of careful order, of a life reduced to essentials and maintained with rigid discipline. Silas Cord stood with his back to her, the rifle now propped against the wall beside the fireplace. He was adding wood to the fire with precise movements, each log placed with deliberate care. He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge her presence in any way. Clara closed the door behind her, shutting out the December cold. The warmth of the cabin enveloped her immediately, and she realized how deeply chilled she'd become during the journey up the mountain. Her fingers ached as feeling returned to them. "There's a corner by the loft ladder," Silas said without turning. "You can put your things there. I'll rig up some privacy curtain tomorrow if you're still here." The "if" hung in the air between them like a threat. "Thank you," Clara said quietly. She dragged her trunk to the indicated corner, acutely aware of how her presence disrupted the careful balance of this space. Everything here had its place, its purpose. She was an intrusion, unwanted and unplanned. She straightened and turned to find Silas watching her now. In the firelight, she could see him more clearly. He was perhaps 40 years old, though the wilderness had weathered him in ways that made age difficult to judge. His face was hard-planed and bearded, his dark eyes guarded. He wore his isolation like armor, every line of his body suggesting a man who'd learned to need nothing and no one. On his belt hung a hunting knife in a worn leather sheath. The handle was carved wood, intricate patterns worn smooth by years of use. Clara found her eyes drawn to it, recognizing it as the kind of knife that became extension of a man's hand, trusted and essential. "I didn't ask for this," Silas said bluntly. "I didn't agree to it. I want you to understand that." "I do understand," Clara replied. "I didn't ask for it either, but here we are." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise maybe at her directness. "Council give you a choice?" "They gave me the illusion of one. Come here or be driven from the territory entirely. What did you do to earn their judgment?" Clara felt the familiar shame try to rise in her chest, but she pushed it down. She was tired of shame. "I married a weak man who made bad choices. When he died, I refused to marry the council leader's son. Apparently, those 2 things together made me unfit for civilized society." Silas studied her for a long moment. Then he moved to the fireplace and lifted a cast-iron pot from a hook over the flames. "There's stew," he said. "You hungry?" The question was so ordinary, so unexpectedly normal, that Clara felt something loosen in her chest. "Yes. Thank you." He ladled stew into 2 wooden bowls, set them on the table, then fetched spoons from a shelf. The movements were economical, practiced. This was a man who'd cooked for himself for a long time. He gestured to one of the chairs, and Clara sat, her stomach suddenly reminding her that she hadn't eaten since early morning. The stew was simple but good. Venison, potatoes, carrots, wild onions. They ate in silence, the only sounds, the crackling of the fire and the scrape of spoons against wood. Clara noticed that Silas kept his knife on his belt, even while eating, one hand always near it. The weapon was clearly more than just a tool. It was comfort, security, protection against a world that had proven itself cruel. After they'd finished, Silas collected the bowls and set them aside for washing. Then he turned to Clara, his expression unreadable. "I'll be clear with you, Mrs. Bennet. I came up this mountain to be alone. I buried everything that mattered to me 8 years ago, and I chose this life because solitude was the only thing I could stand. I don't want company. I don't want conversation. I don't want whatever the town thinks I need." "I understand," Clara said again. "Do you?" His voice roughened. "You're standing in a cabin with a strange man miles from anywhere. You should be terrified. You should be demanding I take you back down immediately." "Should I?" Clara met his gaze steadily. "You've fed me. You've offered me shelter. You haven't made a single threatening move despite being clearly angry about my presence. I think I'm safer here than I was in Sweetwater Ridge, surrounded by respectable people. For the first time, something that might have been respect crossed Silas's face. He reached down and unbuckled his knife belt, setting it deliberately on the table between them. The gesture was significant, Clara understood. He was showing her he meant no harm. "I'll give you tonight and tomorrow to rest," he said. "Day after, if the weather holds, I'll take you back down myself. I'll make it clear to the council that this arrangement isn't acceptable. They can't just dump their problems on my doorstep." Clara nodded, though they both knew his protests would likely fall on deaf ears. The council had made their decision. They wouldn't reverse it because Silas Cord objected. That night, Clara lay on a pallet Silas had prepared for her in the corner, wrapped in her own blanket and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain night. Wind sighed through the pines. Something an owl perhaps called in the darkness. Above her in the loft, she could hear Silas moving around, preparing for sleep. She thought about the knife on his belt, how he'd set it aside during their meal. A small gesture, but meaningful. This was a man who'd been hurt deeply enough to armor himself against the world, yet he still had enough humanity left to recognize when fear needed easing. Clara touched the cameo brooch, still pinned to her dress. Her mother had taught her to look for goodness in people, to believe in the possibility of redemption. Silas Cord might have chosen isolation, might have convinced himself he wanted nothing to do with human connection, but Clara had seen something else in his eyes when he looked at her. Recognition, understanding, the complicated kinship of two people who'd been failed by the world they were supposed to trust. She didn't know what the morning would bring, but lying there in the darkness of that mountain cabin, Clara found herself hoping that the weather wouldn't hold, that something snow, ice, the simple impossibility of the journey would keep her here a little longer. Because despite everything, despite the fear and uncertainty and the absolute strangeness of her situation, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in months. She felt safe. The blizzard arrived 3 hours before dawn. Clara woke to the sound of wind howling around the cabin with a fury that seemed almost alive. The walls shook, the fire had burned low, and cold air crept through gaps in the chinking. She sat up, disoriented, as Silas came down from the loft already fully dressed. "Storm's here," he said shortly. "Bad one. We need to secure everything." He moved with quick efficiency, banking the fire higher, checking the windows, pulling supplies down from the shelves. Clara stood and wrapped her blanket around her shoulders. "What can I do?" "Stay out of the way." But Clara didn't stay out of the way. She watched what he was doing and anticipated his needs, handing him tools before he asked, holding things steady while he worked. After the third time, she correctly guessed what he needed next. Silas paused and looked at her with something approaching approval. "You pay attention," he said. "My father was a carpenter. I learned young that the best help is the kind that doesn't need instruction." They worked together as the storm intensified outside. By the time grey dawn light filtered through the windows, it was clear that no one would be traveling anywhere for days. The snow fell so thick that Clara couldn't see the tree line from the cabin door. Wind piled drifts against the walls higher than her waist. Silas stood at the window, jaw tight, one hand resting on the knife at his belt. Clara could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his breathing had gone shallow. He was trapped, not by the storm but by her presence, by the forced intimacy of sharing his carefully guarded space. "I'm sorry," Clara said quietly. He turned to her, surprise evident on his face. "For what?" "The weather. For being here. For disrupting your peace. I know this isn't what you wanted." Silas was silent for a long moment. Then he moved to the fireplace and began preparing breakfast with the same methodical care he'd shown the night before. "My wants stopped mattering the day I buried my family," he said. "Now I just get through each day and try not to think too hard about the ones that came before. You being here doesn't change that." But it did change it. Clara could see it in the way he moved around the cabin now, hyper-aware of her presence. in the way he kept his distance, as though proximity might somehow obligate him to conversation or connection, in the way his hand kept going to that knife, seeking the comfort of something familiar and trusted. They ate breakfast in silence. Then Silas pulled on his heavy coat and went out to check on the animals in the lean-to. Clara used the time alone to explore the cabin more carefully. Everything was meticulously organized, but there were gaps, absences that spoke volumes. No photographs on the walls, no personal items visible. It was as though Silas had deliberately stripped away anything that might remind him of the life he'd lost. But when Clara moved to organize her own corner, she found a wooden crate tucked under the base of the loft ladder. Inside were folded blankets, a woman's shawl, and something wrapped in oiled cloth. She shouldn't have looked, she knew that. But her seamstress's eye had caught the quality of the fabric, and curiosity overcame propriety. Inside the cloth was a photograph in a simple frame. A woman and a small boy, maybe 5 years old. The woman was pretty, smiling at the camera with a child on her lap. The boy had Silas's eyes. Clara's hands trembled as she carefully rewrapped the photograph and placed everything back exactly as she'd found it. She understood now. This wasn't just a man who'd chosen isolation. This was a man who'd lost everything and was still trying to figure out how to live with that loss. When Silas came back inside, his coat covered in snow, he found Clara sitting by the fire mending a tear in his spare shirt. She'd found it hanging on a peg near the door, the rip obvious and long neglected. He stopped in the doorway, staring at her. "You don't have to do that." "I know," Clara said, her needle moving with practiced ease. "But I'm a seamstress. Seeing a torn shirt and not fixing it would be like you seeing a dull knife and not sharpening it. It's what I do." Silas closed the door and stood there, dripping melting snow onto the floor. His expression was complicated, torn between irritation and something else. Something that looked almost like grief. "Mrs. Bennet," he said carefully, "I need you to understand something. This cabin, this life I've built, it works because I keep everything controlled. I know where things are. I know what to expect each day. When you start changing things, fixing things, making things better, it reminds me that everything here is just barely good enough. And I can't," his voice cracked slightly, "I can't start wanting things to be better. That way lies pain I'm not strong enough to bear." Clara set down her sewing and looked at him directly. "Mr. Cord, I'm not trying to change your life. I'm just trying to be useful while I'm here, but I understand what you're saying. I lost someone too. Different circumstances. But the grief, I imagine that's much the same. So how about this? I'll keep to my corner and my tasks, and you keep to yours. We'll share this space like two people taking shelter from the same storm. No expectations. No obligations. Just survival until spring." Silas studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. He moved to the fireplace and removed the knife from his belt, setting it on the mantel above the fire. Not on the table between them this time, but higher up, farther away, a greater gesture of trust. "Until spring," he agreed. Outside, the blizzard raged on, sealing them into the mountain together. And inside the cabin, two broken people began the careful dance of learning to share space without touching the wounds that had brought them there. January brought deeper cold and longer nights. The woodpile outside shrank steadily, despite Silas's daily efforts to replenish it. Inside the cabin, frost formed intricate patterns on the windows each morning, and Clara's breath misted in the air until the fire was built high enough to chase away the worst of the chill. She'd been with Silas for nearly 6 weeks now, and the thought startled her every time she counted the days. 6 weeks of sharing meals and chores, and the quiet companionship of two people learning to coexist. 6 weeks of watching winter deepen around them, while something else, something she didn't want to name, grew warmer inside the cabin walls. Clara was cleaning the shelf where they kept food supplies when she found the book. It was tucked behind a tin of lard and a sack of dried beans, deliberately hidden but not quite forgotten. The cover was worn leather, water-stained and cracked along the spine. She pulled it out carefully, curious. Inside were recipes written in a woman's careful hand. Not just the recipes, but notes. Observations. Small pieces of life captured in the margins. Daniel won't eat carrots unless I hide them in the stew. Must remember to cut them very small. Silas brought home a deer. Today more meat than we can use. We'll salt most of it but save the best cuts for Sunday dinner. This bread recipe came from my mother. Someday I'll teach it to a daughter, if we're blessed with one. Clara's throat tightened as she read. This was Margaret's book, Margaret's handwriting. Margaret's life, preserved in recipes and small domestic observations that probably seemed unremarkable when she wrote them, but now carried the weight of a world lost. She should put it back. She knew that. This was private, sacred in its way, but she couldn't quite bring herself to close the book. Instead, she turned pages slowly, reading about berry pies and venison roasts and bread made with wild honey. About a life lived simply but fully, about a woman who'd found joy in feeding her family. That was hers. Clara spun around to find Silas standing just inside the door. She hadn't heard him come in. He must have been watching her for some time, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," Clara said quickly, moving to put the book back. "I was cleaning and found it." "I shouldn't have." "No." Silas crossed the cabin in 3 long strides and took the book from her hands, but he didn't put it away. Instead, he stood there holding it, staring at the cover like he was trying to remember something important. Margaret kept this. She collected recipes from other women, wrote down things her mother taught her, experimented with what we could get up here. His thumb traced the water stain on the cover. After she died, I couldn't bear to look at it. But I couldn't throw it away either. "It's beautiful," Clara said softly. "The way she wrote, you can feel how much she loved her family." Silas opened the book randomly and a slip of paper fell out. He caught it before it hit the floor. It was a shopping list in that same careful handwriting. Flour, sugar, coffee, needles, blue thread for Daniel's shirt. Ordinary things. Things that would have been purchased on a trip to town that never happened because Silas had been trapped by that storm. His hands shook as he stared at the list. "She wanted blue thread," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel had torn his favorite shirt and she wanted to fix it with thread that matched exactly. Such a small thing. And I never... He stopped, swallowed hard. "I never got it for her." Clara reached out and gently took the list from his hands. She folded it carefully and placed it back in the book. "She knew you would have if you could. The not getting it wasn't your fault. The storm, the fever, none of that was your fault. Knowing that doesn't make it easier." "No," Clara agreed. "It doesn't. But maybe it's time to remember her life instead of just her death. Maybe it's time to honor what she built instead of what was lost." Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he carried the recipe book to the table and sat down, opening it to a marked page. "This was her best bread recipe," he said. "She made it every Sunday without fail. The whole cabin would smell like heaven." Clara moved to stand beside him, reading over his shoulder. The recipe was detailed, loving in its precision. "Do you remember how it tasted? Like home." Silas's voice was rough with emotion. "Like everything good I ever had. Would you—" Clara hesitated, then pushed forward. "Would you want to make it? Together?" Silas looked up at her, surprise clear on his face. "I haven't baked bread in 8 years. Then maybe it's time." For a moment she thought he'd refuse. He had that look again, that wariness of anything that might crack the careful walls he'd built around his grief. But then he stood and moved to the supply shelf, pulling down a crock of sourdough starter that Clara had noticed before but never seen him use. "Margaret kept this starter alive for 5 years," he said. After she died, I almost let it die too, but I couldn't. So I've been feeding it all this time, even though I never actually baked with it." He set the crock on the table. Seemed wrong to let something she cared for just disappear. They baked the bread following Margaret's recipe exactly. Silas measured ingredients while Clara mixed, their movements synchronizing in a way that felt natural. The physical closeness required Clara reaching past Silas for the flour. Silas leaning over her shoulder to check the consistency would have been uncomfortable 6 weeks ago. Now it felt easy. Right. As they kneaded the dough together, their hands occasionally touching, Silas began to talk, not about Margaret's death, but about her life. About how she'd insisted on bringing books to the cabin because a child needed education even in the wilderness. About how she'd taught Daniel to read using those books, the two of them curled up by the fire on winter evenings. About how she'd sing while she cooked, old songs from her childhood that she'd learned from her own mother. She had a terrible singing voice, Silas said, and there was warmth in his tone now instead of just pain. Couldn't carry a tune to save her life. But Daniel and I loved hearing her try. Clara smiled. My mother couldn't sing either. Used to say she sounded like a crow with a cold, but she'd sing anyway while she sewed. Said music made the work go faster even if the music was bad. They shaped the dough into loaves and set them to rise near the fire. As they waited, Silas paged through the recipe book, showing Clara his favorite entries. Each recipe came with a story. The stew that Daniel wouldn't eat until Margaret told him it was dragon food that would make him brave. The pie she'd made for Silas's birthday using wild berries the three of them had picked together. The simple meals that had sustained a family and created memories. She would have liked you, Silas said suddenly. Margaret. She would have appreciated your strength, your practical nature, the way you don't waste words or energy on things that don't matter. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. I wish I could have known her. So do I. Silas closed the book and looked at Clara directly. His dark eyes held something she hadn't seen before. Not just grief or guardedness, but genuine openness. These weeks with you here, they've reminded me what it's like to have another person in my life. I'd forgotten that it could be good. That sharing space with someone doesn't have to be painful. I feel the same way, Clara admitted. I came here expecting endurance, survival. Instead, I've found, she paused, not quite sure how to finish, peace. Silas offered. Yes, peace, and something more than that. Clara looked down at her hands, still dusted with flour. I know I'll have to leave when spring comes. I know this isn't permanent, but I'm grateful for it anyway. Silas reached out and covered her hand with his. The gesture was simple but significant. In all their weeks together, this was the first time he'd initiated touch without it being purely practical. Spring is still months away, he said quietly. Let's not borrow trouble from the future. The bread, when it finally baked, filled the cabin with exactly the smell Silas had described. Like home. Like everything good. They ate it warm from the oven, slathered with butter, and for those moments, Clara could almost imagine the family that had once lived in this cabin, could almost see Margaret moving around the room, Daniel playing with his wooden horse by the fire, Silas younger and unbroken by grief. That night, Silas kept the recipe book on the table instead of hiding it back on the shelf. And when Clara glanced up at the mantel, she saw he'd added something new beside the wooden horse and his knife. A small wooden spoon, carved with the same care and precision he brought to everything he made. He caught her looking and gave her that rare, small smile. For the next time we bake bread, he said. The next time, Clara echoed, and her heart lifted at the implication. That there would be a next time, that they were building something here day by day, moment by moment, something neither of them had expected to find. Outside, the January wind howled through the pines. Inside, two people who'd lost everything began to discover that maybe, just maybe, they hadn't lost their capacity to hope after all. February arrived with deceptive quiet. The storms that had battered the mountain through January eased, leaving behind a landscape transformed into something almost unbearably beautiful. Snow lay deep and pristine under skies, so clear they seemed impossibly blue. The cold was intense but dry, the kind that made every breath sharp and clean in your lungs. Clara had noticed Silas disappearing into the loft for an hour or so each evening after supper. She'd hear the quiet scrape of his knife against wood, the soft sounds of work being done with patient care. He'd come down eventually with wood shavings caught in his beard, but he never showed her what he was making. She didn't ask. Privacy was a gift they gave each other in this small space, and she respected his need for secrets the same way he respected hers. But one evening in mid-February, Silas came down from the loft and walked directly to where Clara sat. Mending by the fire, he held something in his hands, wrapped in a piece of soft leather. "I made this for you," he said, and there was uncertainty in his voice that she'd never heard before. This was a man who knew his skills, who had confidence in his ability to survive and craft and endure. But this was different. This was personal. Clara set down her sewing and took the wrapped object from him. Inside was a wooden spoon, but nothing like the utilitarian tools they used for cooking. This was art. The handle was carved with an intricate pattern of leaves and vines, so delicate it seemed impossible that it had been created with just a knife. The bowl of the spoon was perfectly smooth, the wood grain carefully selected to show its natural beauty. "Silas," she breathed, "this is extraordinary." "It's maple," he said, sitting down across from her. "Been saving that piece of wood for years, waiting for the right project. Figured you deserved something better than the rough spoons I usually make." Clara ran her fingers over the carved handle, feeling the hours of work it represented, the care, the attention to detail. "I've never owned anything so beautiful." "You should have beautiful things." Silas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression serious. "These months with you here, Clara, I know we started as strangers forced together by circumstance. But somewhere along the way, that changed. You've become—" He paused, searching for words. "You've become important to me." Clara felt her heart quicken. They'd been dancing around this for weeks, this growing connection neither of them wanted to name. But now Silas was naming it, bringing it into the light, and she had to decide how to respond. "You've become important to me too," she said quietly. "More important than I expected. More than is probably wise, given that I'll have to leave in a few months." "About that," Silas straightened, "I've been thinking. When spring comes, you don't have to go back to Sweetwater Ridge. You don't have to face those people again if you don't want to. There are other settlements, other places where you could start fresh." "And how would I get to these other places? I have no money, no way to travel." "I'd take you." He said it simply, as though it were obvious. "I'd make sure you got somewhere safe, somewhere you could build a new life." Clara looked at him carefully. "You'd leave the mountain? You, who hasn't set foot in civilization in 8 years? For you, I would." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning. This wasn't just an offer of help. This was Silas admitting that she'd become significant enough to pull him out of his self-imposed exile, significant enough to face the world he'd been hiding from. "I don't know what to say," Clara admitted. "You don't have to say anything yet. Spring is still 2 months away, maybe more. I just wanted you to know that you have options, that you're not trapped." Clara set the carved spoon carefully on the table between them. "What if I don't want to leave?" Silas went very still. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I've been happier these past 2 months than I've been in years. Maybe ever. I'm saying that this cabin, this life, this mountain, it feels more like home than anywhere I've ever been." She met his eyes directly. "I'm saying that the thought of leaving you makes my chest ache in a way that terrifies me." "Clara," Silas's voice was rough with emotion. "I know it's complicated," she continued quickly. "I know we both have grief we're carrying. I know that neither of us expected this. But I can't pretend I don't feel it, Silas. I can't pretend that every time you smile at me, my heart doesn't leap. I can't pretend that I don't lie awake at night thinking about what it would mean to stay. Silas stood and moved around the table. He took Clara's hands and pulled her gently to her feet so they stood face to face. I've been alone for 8 years, he said. I convinced myself I wanted it that way, that solitude was safety. But you've shown me that I was wrong. I wasn't safe. I was just empty. And now I'm terrified, he admitted. Because caring about you, wanting you here, hoping for a future that means risking loss again. It means opening myself up to the possibility of more grief, and I don't know if I'm strong enough for that. Clara reached up and touched his bearded face gently. I'm terrified too. After Thomas, after the town, I thought I'd never trust anyone again, never let anyone close enough to hurt me. But here you are, and I can't seem to help myself. We're quite a pair, Silas said, and there was warmth in his voice now, almost humor. 2 broken people trying to figure out if they can build something whole together. Can we? Clara asked. Is that even possible? Instead of answering with words, Silas drew her closer. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, he bent his head and kissed her. It was gentle, tentative, the kiss of 2 people who'd forgotten how to be close to another person and were relearning together. Clara melted into it, her hands moving to his shoulders for balance. This was different from anything she'd felt with Thomas. This was built on shared grief and mutual understanding and the slow accumulation of trust over cold winter months. This felt solid, real. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathless. Stay, Silas said simply. When spring comes, don't leave. Stay here with me. Build a life on this mountain. It won't be easy. It won't be comfortable by town standards. But it will be honest. And it will be ours. Clara thought about Sweetwater Ridge waiting below, with its judgment and its memories, and its counsel that had cast her out. She thought about the cameo brooch pinned to her dress, the last link to her mother, and the respectable life she'd once imagined. She thought about the carved spoon on the table, made with care and offered with hope. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll stay. Silas pulled her close again, holding her like she was precious. Outside, the February night was clear and cold. Stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The mountains stood silent and strong around them. And inside the cabin, 2 people who'd lost everything found something neither of them had dared to hope for. They found each other. And for the first time in longer than either could remember, they found the courage to believe in tomorrow. March brought the first real signs of spring. The snow began to melt in earnest during the warmest part of the day, though it still froze hard at night. Water dripped from the cabin's eaves in a constant rhythm. The creek, frozen solid since December, began to show cracks and open patches. Birds returned to the pines, their songs transforming the mountain's silence into something vibrant and alive. Clara and Silas had settled into a new kind of closeness. She'd moved some of her things up to the loft, though they were careful and respectful with each other, still learning the territory of shared intimacy after years of being alone. They talked more now, sharing not just histories but hopes. Plans for spring planting, ideas for expanding the cabin. Small dreams that felt enormous after so much grief. Clara was outside hanging laundry on the line. Silas had strung between 2 trees when she saw the rider approaching through the thinning snow. Her heart jumped into her throat. In all the months she'd been here, no one had come to the mountain except that first day when Martin Garrett had brought her up. She hurried inside. Silas, someone's coming. He was at the window immediately, his jaw tight. That's young Porter from the general store. Council must have sent him. They went out onto the porch together as the boy, he couldn't have been more than 16, pulled his horse to a stop in the clearing. He looked nervous, his eyes darting between Silas and Clara like he wasn't sure which of them was more dangerous. "Mr. Cord, Mrs. Bennet," he said, touching his hat. Council sent me up with an official letter for Mrs. Bennet. Was told to deliver it direct into her hands and wait for a response. Clara's stomach clenched. She took the envelope from the boy's outstretched hand. The paper was thick and expensive, the kind the council used for important business. Her name was written across it in Council Leader Harrison's distinctive hand. "You want to come inside, warm up while I read this?" Clara asked the boy. "No, ma'am, thank you. I'll just wait with my horse if that's all right." Clara and Silas went back inside. She sat at the table and broke the seal on the envelope while Silas stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder. The letter was longer than she'd expected, written in formal language that barely disguised the threat beneath. She read it once, quickly, then again more slowly as the full implications sank in. "What does it say?" Silas asked. Clara's hands were shaking. "They want me to come back to Sweetwater Ridge. They're calling a formal inquiry into my conduct. They say if I don't appear within 10 days of receiving this letter, I'll be declared an outlaw and barred from all settlements in the territory." "On what grounds?" "They don't specify exactly, but they reference new evidence that's come to light regarding my husband's death and my role in his financial dealings." Clara looked up at Silas, feeling the familiar fear and anger rising in her chest. "This is James Harrison's doing. It has to be. His father's using the council to force me back." Silas took the letter from her hands and read it himself, his expression darkening with each line. "This is persecution, not justice. They exiled you up here, hoping you'd disappear. And now that you haven't come crawling back broken and begging, they're manufacturing reasons to punish you further. What new evidence could they possibly have?" Clara's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "Thomas died of a heart attack. There was nothing suspicious about it, and his debts were his own. I had nothing to do with his gambling or his poor choices. Truth doesn't matter to men like Harrison." Silas set the letter down with carefully controlled violence. "This is about power. About a man who couldn't control you through marriage, so he's using the law to control you instead." Clara stood and paced to the window, looking out at the melting snow and the returning spring. She'd been so happy these past weeks, so hopeful. She'd allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could leave the past behind and build something new. But the past wasn't done with her yet. "I have to go back," she said quietly. "No." Silas's voice was flat, absolute. "You don't. We can leave right now. Pack what we need and head north into Canada or west into the territories where the council has no authority. And spend the rest of my life running, looking over my shoulder? Never able to settle anywhere because I'm wanted for crimes I didn't commit? Better that than walking into their trap." Clara turned to face him. "It's not a trap if I know it's coming. And I'm not the frightened woman I was when I came here, Silas. These months with you have reminded me who I am. I'm not someone who runs from false accusations. I'm someone who stands her ground. Standing your ground against corrupt men with the law on their side is a good way to get destroyed," Silas said, and there was fear in his voice now, raw and urgent. "I can't lose you, Clara. Not now. Not when I've just found you." Clara crossed the room and took his hands in hers. "Then come with me. Stand with me. Help me fight this. I haven't been to town in 8 years. I've spent that time becoming the ghost they whisper about, the wild man they use to frighten their children. What good would my support do you? I'd probably make things worse. You'd make things better because you'd be there, because you know me, because you can testify to my character." Clara squeezed his hands. "And because maybe it's time you came down from this mountain and stopped letting fear dictate your life." Silas pulled away from her, agitation clear in every line of his body. "That's not fair, isn't it? You've been hiding up here for 8 years, Silas, punishing yourself for surviving when your family didn't, convincing yourself that isolation is strength when really it's just a different kind of prison." Clara's voice softened. "I love you. I want to build a life with you, but I need to face this. I need to clear my name so I can move forward without this shadow hanging over me. And I need to know that you're strong enough to face your own demons too." The words hung between them the first time either had said, "I love you," out loud. Silas stared at her, his expression torn between fear and longing. "You love me," he said finally, as though testing the words. "I do. God help me, I do." Silas moved to the mantel and picked up the wooden horse, turning it over in his hands. "When Daniel died, I thought I'd die too. The grief was so overwhelming that I couldn't imagine surviving it. But I did survive, and that felt like the worst betrayal of all, like I was dishonoring his memory by continuing to breathe." "I know," Clara said gently. "Margaret would hate what I've become. She'd hate that I used our tragedy as an excuse to stop living." He set the horse back carefully. "She always said that life was meant to be lived fully, even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. She said that was how we honored the people we'd lost, by refusing to waste the time we'd been given." "She sounds very wise." "She was." Silas turned back to Clara, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "If we do this, if we go down there and face the council, there's no guarantee it will work out. They could arrest you. They could make good on their threats. I know. We could lose everything we've built here. We could, or we could win. We could clear my name and come back here together, free to build a real future without the shadow of false accusations hanging over us." Clara moved to him and cupped his bearded face in her hands. "I need to do this, Silas, and I need you with me. Not because I can't face it alone, but because I don't want to, because we're stronger together than we are apart." Silas closed his eyes and leaned into her touch. When he opened them again, Clara saw the decision had been made. "All right, we go together, we face them together, and whatever happens, we come through it together." "Together," Clara agreed. They went back outside to where the boy was waiting patiently with his horse. Clara handed him the letter. "You can tell the council I'll be there in 7 days, and I won't be coming alone." The boy's eyes widened as he looked at Silas, clearly recognizing the stories he'd heard didn't quite match the man standing before him. "Yes, ma'am, I'll tell them." After he rode away, Clara and Silas stood in the clearing watching the sun move across the sky. There was so much to do. Preparations to make, evidence to gather. They'd need to visit the neighboring settlements, talk to people who'd known Thomas, find documentation of his actual business dealings versus the lies the council was spreading. "I have something that might help," Silas said suddenly. "After I buried Margaret and Daniel, I stored some of their things with a friend in a town about 30 miles west of here. A man I served with in the war, someone I trust. He might still have connections that could help us." "You were in the war?" "Artillery company, Union side. Served 3 years before I was wounded and sent home." Silas touched his left shoulder unconsciously. "Got a medal for something I barely remember doing. Buried it away with the rest of my past, but maybe it's time to dig some things up." Clara felt hope kindle in her chest. A decorated war veteran defending a widow against corrupt council members. That could work in our favor. "Maybe." Silas looked down at her, his expression serious. "But I want you to understand something, Clara. Even if we win this fight, even if we clear your name and expose Harrison's corruption, there will be consequences. The town won't welcome us. We'll always be outsiders. We're already outsiders," Clara pointed out. "The only difference is we'll be free outsiders." Silas smiled then, that rare, beautiful smile that transformed his whole face. "When did you get so brave?" "When I had something worth fighting for." Clara rose up on her toes and kissed him. "Now let's start planning. We have 7 days to build a case strong enough to destroy James Harrison's lies, and maybe, just maybe, change both our lives forever." Inside the cabin, Clara's cameo brooch still sat on the shelf where she kept her few precious things, but beside it now was the carved spoon Silas had made her, and on the mantel were the wooden horse and the hunting knife and the recipe book. Symbols of grief and loss, yes, but also symbols of survival, of the stubborn human capacity to keep living, keep hoping, keep building, even after everything falls apart. Spring was coming to the mountain, and with it, the chance for something new, something better, something worth the risk of heartbreak. Clara and Silas stood together at the threshold of that possibility, neither of them quite sure what came next, but both of them finally ready to find out. They left the mountain 3 days later, giving themselves time to reach Silas's friend before heading to Sweetwater Ridge. Silas had been methodical in his preparations, packing supplies with the same careful precision he brought to everything. But Clara noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw stayed tight as they descended the trail he hadn't traveled in 8 years. "You all right?" she asked as they paused to rest the horses. "No," Silas said honestly, "but I will be." The first settlement they reached was barely more than a trading post and a handful of cabins, but the people there knew Silas by reputation, if not by face. The postmaster, an older man named Sullivan, greeted them with cautious respect. "Heard you'd gone wild up on that mountain cord," Sullivan said, glad to see the stories were exaggerated. "Most stories are," Silas replied. "We're looking for information, records from 3 years ago. Specifically anything related to Thomas Bennett's business dealings." Sullivan's expression grew guarded. "That's a name I remember. Man came through here trying to borrow money, said he had sure investments in Sweetwater Ridge. I turned him down, something about him didn't sit right." "Why, you asking?" Clara stepped forward. "I'm his widow. The council in Sweetwater Ridge is claiming I had something to do with his debts and poor decisions. I'm trying to gather evidence that his financial troubles had nothing to do with me." "Well, you weren't with him when he came here, I can say that much." He was alone and desperate. Sullivan disappeared into his office and came back with a ledger. "Kept notes on everyone who asks for credit. See here, February of '76. Thomas Bennett, denied loan. Note says, already overextended elsewhere, likely won't repay." Clara felt vindication surge through her. "Would you be willing to testify to that? To put it in writing?" "Don't see why not. Man's dead, and truth is truth." Sullivan wrote out a brief statement and signed it. "This help you?" "More than you know," Clara said. "Thank you." They gathered similar evidence at 2 more settlements over the next 2 days. Each stop revealed the same pattern. Thomas had been borrowing money from multiple sources, gambling on investments that never materialized, spiraling into debt long before Clara even knew there was a problem. By the time they reached the town where Silas's friend lived, Clara had a folder full of statements that painted a clear picture of her husband's financial irresponsibility and her complete separation from those dealings. But she knew it might not be enough. The council had power in Sweetwater Ridge, and they'd already decided she was guilty. Evidence might sway some people, but men like Harrison didn't change their minds just because truth contradicted their narrative. Silas's friend, Robert Hayes, ran a small freight business out of a town called Cedar Falls. He was a big man, barrel-chested and weathered, with shrewd eyes that seemed to see straight through to your bones. When he saw Silas riding into town, his face split into a grin. "Silas Cord, you old ghost. Heard you died up on that mountain years ago." Hayes clapped Silas on the back hard enough to make him stagger. "Damn good to see I was wrong. Good to see you too, Robert." Silas returned the embrace briefly, then stepped back. "I need your help." Figured as much. You wouldn't come down from your hermit hole just to reminisce." "Clara Bennett, Silas paused, seemed to make a decision. "My intended wife." Clara felt warmth flood through her at the words. They hadn't discussed marriage explicitly, but hearing Silas claim her that way made something settle into place in her heart. Hayes whistled low. Well, never thought I'd see the day. Come inside, both of you. Tell me what kind of trouble you've gotten into." Over coffee and pie provided by Hayes's wife, Catherine, they explained the situation. Hayes listened carefully, his expression growing darker as the story unfolded. "Council Leader Harrison, you say?" Hayes sat back in his chair. "Know the name. Tried to do business with him years ago, but something about him set my teeth on edge. Man's too smooth, if you understand me. The kind who always has an angle. His son proposed to Clara. She refused him. This is retaliation," Silas said bluntly. "And now they're using the law to punish her for having standards. Power corrupts, and small-town power corrupts absolutely." He looked at Silas thoughtfully. "You still have that medal? The one they gave you after Richmond?" Silas's hand went unconsciously to his chest, though the medal wasn't there. "It's in storage here with the other things I left with you." "Why?" "Because a decorated war veteran defending a widow's honor carries weight, Silas, especially if that veteran is willing to stand up in front of the whole town and call out corruption when he sees it." Hayes stood and moved to a back room. He returned with a wooden box, weathered but intact. "Your things, just like you left them." Silas opened the box slowly. Inside were carefully folded clothes, a few books, and wrapped in oiled cloth, a bronze medal attached to a faded ribbon. He lifted it out and held it up to the light. The metal was tarnished, but the inscription was still clear: "For valor above and beyond." "What did you do to earn that?" Clara asked softly. "Saved my artillery unit when Confederate forces overran our position," Silas said, his voice distant with memory. "Held them off long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Lost a lot of good men that day, but we held the line." He looked at the medal like it belonged to someone else. "Hasn't felt like valor in a long time. Felt more like I just survived when better men didn't." "That's the guilt talking," Hayes said firmly. "You were a hero then, Silas. And maybe it's time to be a hero again. Not on a battlefield, but in a council chamber, fighting a different kind of enemy." Silas closed his hand around the medal. "I'm not sure I'm the same man who earned this." "No one's the same man they were in their youth," Hayes said. "We grow, we change, we get broken and put ourselves back together as best we can. But courage, real courage, that doesn't disappear. It just waits for the right moment to show itself again." Catherine Hayes, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. "I'll testify too, if it helps. I knew Thomas Bennett slightly. He tried to convince my brother to invest in some scheme a few years back. My brother refused. Thank God, because the whole thing fell apart within months. I can speak to the man's character, or lack thereof. And I can round up a few other businessmen who had dealings with Bennett," Hayes added. "Men whose word carries weight in these parts. We'll come to Sweetwater Ridge with you and make sure the truth gets heard." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Why would you do this for us? You don't even know me." "Don't need to know you," Catherine said kindly. "I know Silas, and I know he wouldn't fight this hard for someone who didn't deserve it. Besides, I've seen what men like Harrison do to women who don't fall in line. It's time someone pushed back." They spent that night with the Hayes family, and Catherine helped Clara prepare for the confrontation ahead. She lent Clara a dress, simple but well-made and respectable. "You need to look like a proper widow, not like someone the town can dismiss," Catherine explained. "First impressions matter, especially when you're fighting prejudice." Silas spent the evening with Robert, discussing strategy. When Clara finally found him sitting alone on the Hayes' porch, looking out at the darkened street, she sat beside him. "Second thoughts?" she asked. "Third and fourth thoughts," Silas admitted. "I keep thinking about all the ways this could go wrong, about what it will mean if we lose. And if we win? If we win, we go back to the mountain and live our lives in peace. Build that cabin extension we talked about, plant a garden come spring. Maybe," he paused, then pushed forward, "maybe start a family. If we're blessed that way." Clara's breath caught. They hadn't talked about children, though the possibility had hovered unspoken between them. "You'd want that?" After losing Daniel? I'm terrified of it, Silas said honestly. The thought of loving a child again, of risking that kind of loss, it makes my chest tight and my hands shake. But the thought of never having that chance because I'm too afraid? That's worse. He turned to her and took her hand. You've taught me that hiding from life isn't the same as protecting yourself. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is risk your heart again. Clara leaned against his shoulder. We're going to win this, Silas. We have truth on our side, and good people willing to speak it. We have each other. That has to count for something. It counts for everything, Silas said. He pulled the medal from his pocket and looked at it in the moonlight. I earned this by refusing to retreat when retreat would have been easier. I suppose tomorrow I get to prove whether I still have that kind of courage. You do, Clara said with certainty. I've seen it every day these past months. The courage to let someone in, the courage to hope again, the courage to love, despite knowing how much it can hurt. That's valor too. Silas. Maybe the truest kind. They sat together in the darkness, drawing strength from each other's presence. Tomorrow they would ride into Sweetwater Ridge with their allies and their evidence. Tomorrow they would face the council and demand justice. Tomorrow they would fight for their right to a future together. But tonight, they were just two people who'd found each other against all odds, holding on tight and hoping it would be enough. The next morning dawned clear and cold. They set out for Sweetwater Ridge with Robert and Catherine Hayes, along with 3 other businessmen who'd agreed to testify about Thomas Bennett's character and financial dealings. It was a small group, but Clara felt strength in their numbers. These were good people, willing to stand against corruption because it was the right thing to do. As they rode, Silas wore his medal pinned to his coat. He'd polished it the night before until it gleamed. Clara wore her mother's cameo brooch, and in her bag she carried the carved spoon Silas had made her, along with all the evidence they'd gathered. Symbols of who they'd been, who they'd lost, and who they were becoming. The mountains rose around them, familiar and constant. Soon they'd leave this high country and descend into the valley where Sweetwater Ridge waited, where judgment and conflict waited, but also where the possibility of freedom waited. Clara reached across the space between their horses and took Silas's hand briefly. He squeezed back, his grip strong and sure. They were ready. Whatever came next, they would face it together. "This is ridiculous," James Harrison burst out before his father could respond. "You're all being taken in by a woman who seduced a hermit and convinced him to lie for her." "That's enough, James," Harrison Sr. said sharply, but James was beyond listening. "She's a manipulator. She refused my honorable proposal and ran off to play house with a madman on the mountain. Now she comes back here with fabricated evidence and you're all ready to believe her lies." "Mr. Harrison," Silas's voice cut through James's tirade like a blade, "I suggest you be very careful with your next words." "Or what?" James sneered. "You'll hurt me? Prove me right about what you are." Silas didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out his medal, holding it up so the entire room could see. "I'm a decorated veteran who served his country with honor. I'm a man who lost his wife and son to fever and had the courage to keep living anyway. And I'm a man who knows integrity when I sees it." He looked directly at James, "which is why I recognize what Clara Bennett possesses and what you lack." The room went silent. Even James seemed at a loss for words in the face of Silas's quiet dignity. "Before my wife Margaret died," Silas continued, "she wrote a letter to her sister back east. The letter never got sent because the fever took her before I could make it to town. I've kept it all these years." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, the creases worn soft with age. "With the council's permission, I'd like to read a portion of it." Harrison looked like he wanted to object, but too many eyes were watching. "Proceed," he said tightly. Silas unfolded the letter carefully. His voice was steady as he read, "Dear Sarah, I write to you from our cabin in the mountains where Silas and I have made our home. Life here is hard but good. My husband is the finest man I've ever known, steady, kind, devoted to his family. He works himself to exhaustion to provide for Daniel and me, yet he never complains. I fear sometimes that I don't tell him often enough how much I love him, how proud I am to be his wife. If anything should happen to me, I hope he knows that he made my life full of joy, that our son will grow up to be just like his father, strong and gentle and true. Silas Cord is proof that goodness exists in this hard world, and I thank God every day that I found him." Silas's voice caught slightly on the last words. He looked up from the letter and met Clara's eyes across the room. She saw tears on his face and felt her own eyes burning. "That's the man I was," Silas said quietly. "The man Margaret saw in me. After she died, I forgot how to be that person. I convinced myself I was better off alone, that I couldn't survive loving someone again." He turned to face the council. "But Clara Bennett reminded me who I used to be. She saw past the grief and the isolation to the man I'd buried, and she gave me a reason to want to be that man again." He walked to where Clara sat and took her hand, pulling her gently to her feet. "This woman is honest, hard-working, and kind. She's faced false accusations with dignity. She's endured exile with grace. She's survived loss and betrayal and still found the strength to hope for better." He looked at Harrison. "Which is more than I can say for the men who've persecuted her." "Are you accusing this council of misconduct, Mr. Cord?" Harrison asked dangerously. "I'm saying that Clara Bennett deserves justice, not persecution. And if this council can't see the difference, then maybe this council isn't fit to serve." The crowd erupted again. Several voices called out in agreement. Clara saw shock and approval on many faces. These were people who'd lived under Harrison's authority for years, perhaps resenting it, but never daring to speak against it. Now Silas had given them permission to question. Sheriff Coleman stood. "Council Leader Harrison, I think we need to address some hard truths here. That forged ledger didn't create itself. Someone went to considerable effort to manufacture evidence against Mrs. Bennett. I'd like to know who and why, and whether this council was complicit." "I object to the implication," Walsh began. "The ledger came from you, Mr. Walsh," Hayes pointed out. "You claimed it was found among Bennett's effects. Yet my examination suggests it was created within the last few weeks. How do you explain that?" Walsh went pale. I was given it by—" He glanced at James Harrison and stopped. "By whom, Mr. Walsh?" Sheriff Coleman pressed. The silence stretched. Then a woman's voice called out from the crowd. "James Harrison brought that ledger to the bank 3 weeks ago. I work there. I saw him." All eyes turned to James, whose face had gone from red to white. "She's lying." "Am I?" The woman stepped forward, young, plainly dressed, clearly nervous but determined. "You came in asking about Mrs. Bennett's accounts. Mr. Walsh told you they were settled. 2 days later, you came back with that ledger and convinced him it proved she'd been hiding money." "This is absurd." James looked at his father desperately. "Father, you can't possibly." But Harrison Sr. was looking at his son with something like horror dawning on his face. "James, what have you done?" "What I had to do." James's composure shattered completely. "She humiliated me, refused me in front of half the town, then ran off to live in sin with that mountain hermit. She deserved to be punished." The admission hung in the air like a gunshot's echo. "So you manufactured evidence," Sheriff Coleman said flatly. "You created false documentation to destroy an innocent woman's reputation because your pride was hurt." "She's not innocent. She's Enough!" Harrison Sr.'s voice was like iron. He looked at his son with disgust and disappointment. "You've disgraced yourself and this family. Sheriff Coleman, I believe you have grounds for charges." Coleman nodded grimly. "Fraud, conspiracy, defamation. That's just for starters." Clara watched James Harrison crumble under the weight of his own actions. She should have felt triumph, but instead she just felt tired. Tired of fighting, tired of being afraid, tired of carrying the weight of other people's judgments. "Council members," Reverend Michaels said quietly, "I move that all charges and accusations against Clara Bennett be permanently dismissed. Furthermore, I move that we issue a public apology for the treatment she's received from this town." "Seconded," said Patterson immediately. "All in favour?" Michaels looked at the other council members. One by one, even Walsh, they raised their hands. Harrison sat frozen, his authority crumbling around him. "The motion carries," Michaels declared. "Mrs. Bennett, on behalf of Sweetwater Ridge, I apologize for the injustice you've endured. You are free to go with your name and reputation restored." Clara felt Silas's hand tighten on hers. She looked up at him and saw pride and love shining in his eyes. They'd won. 3 weeks later, Clara stood on the newly expanded porch of the mountain cabin, watching the late April sun paint the valley below in shades of gold and green. Spring had come fully to the high country, bringing wild flowers and new growth and the constant music of birdsong. The world felt reborn, and so did she. Behind her, she heard Silas moving around inside the cabin, adding logs to the fireplace, even though the days were warm now. Old habits died hard, and she loved him for his careful preparations, his need to ensure they were always ready for whatever might come. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind. After the council hearing, several townspeople had approached Clara with genuine apologies. Mrs. Patterson had been among them, admitting she'd been too quick to judge, too willing to believe gossip over truth. A few of the younger women had asked if Clara might teach them sewing, acknowledging her skill after years of dismissing it. Clara had accepted the apologies with grace, but she'd also been clear. Her home was on the mountain now, with Silas. She'd come down to town occasionally for supplies or to teach sewing when asked, but her life, her real life, was in that cabin among the pines. The day after the hearing, they'd been married by Reverend Michaels in a simple ceremony attended by Robert and Catherine Hayes and a handful of townspeople brave enough to defy the Harrisons' remaining influence. Clara had worn Catherine's borrowed dress and her mother's cameo brooch. Silas had worn his medal and a new shirt Clara had sewn for him. They'd spoken their vows with quiet certainty, two people who'd found each other through pain and chose each other despite it. James Harrison had been arrested and charged. His trial was set for the summer. Council leader Harrison had resigned in disgrace, and the town was in the process of electing new leadership. Clara found she didn't much care how it all turned out. Let Sweetwater Ridge sort itself out. She had better things to do. The door opened, and Silas stepped out onto the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Clara and wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. She leaned into his warmth, marveling as she always did at how natural this felt. How right. "Package came up with the supply wagon today," Silas said. "From Catherine Hayes." Clara turned to look at him, curious. "What is it?" "A wedding gift," the note said. "Thought you might want to open it together." They went inside and found the package on the table, a large, flat parcel wrapped in brown paper. Clara untied the string and folded back the wrapping to reveal a quilt, beautifully sewn from dozens of different fabric squares. Each square was a different pattern, a different color, clearly sourced from multiple donors. A note fell out as Clara lifted the quilt. "Dear Clara and Silas, this quilt was made by the women of Cedar Falls and a few brave souls from Sweetwater Ridge. Each woman contributed a square. We wanted you to have something that represents community and new beginnings. May it keep you warm through many winters together. With love and respect, Catherine Hayes." Clara ran her hands over the quilt, recognizing the work of different seamstresses in each square. Some stitches were expert, others more amateur, but all were done with care. She found herself crying, touched by the gesture in a way she hadn't expected. "It's beautiful," Silas said softly, "and appropriate. You've sown so much for others. Nice that someone sewed something for you." They spread the quilt over their bed that night, and Clara marveled at how it transformed the space. The cabin that had been Silas's lonely refuge was truly theirs now. The loft held both their belongings. The shelves contained Clara's sewing supplies alongside Silas's tools. Margaret's recipe book sat on the table next to Clara's mother's letters. The wooden horse stood on the mantel beside the carved spoon and the cameo brooch. Past and present, loss and hope, all woven together into something new. In the weeks that followed, they settled into their life with easy rhythm. Silas taught Clara more about living off the land which plants were edible, how to track game, where to find the sweetest berries. Clara taught him things too, though she hadn't expected it. She taught him to laugh again, to plan for tomorrow instead of just surviving today, to believe that joy wasn't betrayal of the dead, but celebration of the living. They planted a garden together in the clearing beside the cabin, vegetables and herbs, but also flowers. Margaret had loved flowers, Silas said, and Clara thought she'd appreciate the gesture. They talked about building a larger cabin eventually, something with room for the children they both hoped for but didn't quite dare to speak of yet. One evening in early May, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountain peaks, Clara realized she was completely, utterly content. "What are you thinking?" Silas asked, watching her face in the fading light. "I'm thinking about how far I've come," Clara said. 4 months ago, I was being sent up this mountain as punishment. I was broken and scared and convinced my life was over. And now I understand that sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best things. If Sweetwater Ridge hadn't cast me out, I never would have found you. Never would have found this life. Never would have discovered who I really am when I'm not trying to live up to someone else's expectations." Silas pulled her closer. "I was thinking something similar. For 8 years I thought I was protecting myself by staying alone up here. Turned out I was just hiding. You gave me a reason to stop hiding." "We saved each other," Clara said simply. "We did." They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere below, Sweetwater Ridge was settling in for the night, its people safe in their houses and their certainties. But up here on the mountain, 2 outcasts had built something those people would never understand. Something based not on judgment or propriety or social standing, but on truth, on accepting each other completely, scars and all, on choosing love even when love was risky. Clara thought about the quilt on their bed, made from pieces contributed by different hands, different lives, all sewn together into something useful and beautiful. That's what she and Silas had done too. Taken broken pieces, grief and loss, hope and courage, memory and dreams, and sewn them into a life worth living. The mountains stood strong and silent around them, witness to their transformation. And in that cabin where 2 broken people had learned to be whole, lamplight glowed warm against the gathering dark. A new beginning, a second chance, a love that had grown from the most unlikely soil and bloomed against all odds. Clara Bennett Cord looked at her husband, at their home, at the life they were building together, and smiled. She'd been cast out by a town that thought it knew her worth. Instead, she'd found her value in the quiet strength of a mountain man who saw her truly and loved her anyway. Sometimes the people we cast aside, she thought again, remembering the opening words of her story, are the ones who needed us most. But sometimes those cast-aside people find each other, and together they build something stronger than the judgment that tried to break them. The end.